Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all viewers to the next installment of the Coffee Break Conversations. My name is Justin Burke. I'm the editor of EurasiaNet, a news website that focuses on Central Asia and the Caucasus. And to my left is Damon Wilson, who is the executive vice president at the Atlantic Council right now. Prior to that, Damon was serving at the National Security Council in Washington, D.C., and also had extensive diplomatic experience. To my right is Jos Boonstra. Jos is the head of EUCAM in Brussels, and he has published widely on Central Asian and Caucasus affairs. The title of our talk today is The Role of Central Asia on the Geopolitical Map. I would say that Central Asia has been defined in the last decade by the war in Afghanistan as well as energy exports. But in the very near future, that is going to change. Central Asia is going to enter, provided the withdrawal of U.S. and NATO forces proceeds as planned, it's going to enter a tricky phase, a transitional phase. And I'd like to start off this conversation today by asking both my guests about that transition. Are the Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, are they prepared for this transition, as prepared as they could be? And what do you think the odds are that the transition will be a stable one? I guess I'll start with you, Damon.
Sure. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you here for this conversation. I think it is important. You ask about the transition in Afghanistan, but the transition more largely in the region is what's about to happen. I think we're headed for a fairly risky period, frankly. I don't think, I'm worried that the international community is not fully prepared for this. As you mentioned, this region has really been at the heart of policy debates in the past decade plus, in part because of the Afghanistan operation and certainly from an American perspective, from a U.S. presence in Afghanistan, and also because of the energy issues. The challenge of getting this transition as ISAF comes to an end, the challenge of getting this right is the transatlantic community, the United States and Europe. Do we find a way to remain engaged in Central Asia in a way constructively that actually doesn't just open up a vacuum and sort of leave these countries, in some respects, on their own, dealing with large neighbors to the north and the east, Russia and China in particular, with a certain degree of unpredictable instability in the south? I don't think this region is prepared. The region is, in many ways, looks stable today, but it is a brittle stability that, if it were buffeted by forces, could potentially raise concerns about what might happen in the region. But if the United States and Europe are able to figure out and be serious about a long-term commitment and engagement, not just in Afghanistan, but with the region, that builds on our energy relationships, that expands economic ties, that brings a little bit of reality in the economic numbers to a lot of the rhetoric behind the idea of a new Silk Road. If we can couple that, a comprehensive strategy, along with the drawdown on our forces, we have a chance to help give a little bit more space, a little bit more oxygen to these countries so that they can play a more direct role in determining their own future and taking their own decisions, protecting their own sovereignty and independence. But I have to admit, I'm a little worried about the resolve and the sustainability of policies that are being developed right now in Washington and Brussels, and how the region has prepared itself.
Well, I want to definitely follow up on that, but first I want to get Jos's views.
I have to largely agree here. I think the focus of the United States and of Europe is for a large part on Afghanistan itself and withdrawal of troops and the future of Afghanistan. Central Asia is often seen here as a partner that could play a positive role. Well, I don't see really this positive role. I see also Central Asia as a source of instability in the future. And that is really a big concern. All the security threats to the region, ranging from tensions over water to extremism, but especially also the lack of democracy. These are very authoritarian states. And what we, for instance, see that these states have become very concerned that the EU and NATO and the United States will lose interest as soon as troops have been withdrawn from Afghanistan. So that's why they constantly push the issue of Afghanistan as a source of instability for the future. And by pushing this issue, they also divert the real threats to their own region. They try to divert the attention from that. So I think that indeed the EU and US should think hard to adapt their policies and think long term, and should also try to sit down together and see what they can do. Of course, also with other big players like Russia, China, and so on. But the EU and US share a lot of objectives in Central Asia, I think.
Now, Damon, you mentioned the Silk Road project. Mm-hmm. There's obviously been a lot of talk about the Silk Road initiative in Washington especially, but let's look at reality on the ground. The NDN, as it's currently constituted, is not a model of efficiency, to put it lightly.
Yes.
The NDN experiences a lot of bottlenecks, especially in Uzbekistan. Mm-hmm. It would seem that the withdrawal of U.S. and NATO forces would not change any of the conditions. Mm-hmm. Corruption is a major factor. How on earth can we actually clear some of these obstacles that currently exist in Central Asia, and there's no apparent way or easy way to address them?
Well, this is a test in many respects. So don't get me wrong, I actually am pretty enthusiastic about the idea of trying to create a stronger policy and sense of a Eurasian trade and transit initiative, project, effort that really has to be driven by the economics, but given the infrastructure and support from the governments. But it's a test in the region. We hear from many of the governments, several of them in particular, quite strong interest in ensuring that some of this concept really does develop, because they want that connection with the countries of Europe and the United States, with the transatlantic community. They want the economic trade and growth that has the potential to come from that. But at the same time, they have to appreciate that to make this work, that's going to require some real homework at home. You can't focus on your trade globally if you put up barriers to regional integration and cooperation within Central Asia. For this to work and to address some of the bottlenecks that we've seen in India and some of the very practical bottlenecks, it's going to require more cooperation among the 5 republics of Central Asia themselves to begin to remove some of those barriers, cross-border, literal bottlenecks, as well as regulatory issues, and that if they want to see a serious commitment on the part of the United States and Brussels to moving forward with these ideas, it will take some steps forward on the economic reform fronts, on issues of transparency, on addressing a more predictable environment for contracts, rule of law in the economic space, addressing difficult issues of corruption. But I think that's where there's potential, why the project's so appealing, because the Central Asian republics know that with the drawdown in Afghanistan, if they don't move forward with an attractive way to keep the United States and Europe engaged, they're going to be left increasingly to deal with being buffeted by very large neighbors on their own. If they really do want to help give themselves other options and other alternatives, it's going to take some tough decisions at home that will provide the right incentives for Western businesses and economic interests to engage. If there is a playing field that isn't increasingly predictable, governed by rule of law, less dominated by corrupt interests, how are American or European businesses going to go head-to-head to compete with a Chinese business on that terrain? That's not favorable. Those aren't favorable odds. So I think there's an incentive in the region for the governments to take some tough decisions to make this whole effort even more appealing for the United States and Europe. I don't want to be naive about where this is going, But I would want to sort of push that effort and push that objective because I think it's worth it.
Now, Jos, I think everyone here would agree that unity or far greater level of cooperation than currently exists among the Central Asian states would help them address some of the challenges. What are the prospects, as you see them, for unity among Central Asian states?
They are not very good. It's quite a bleak picture, I think. The problem is on almost all issues, security, but as we're now talking about trade, regional cooperation is completely lacking in that region. And this is why you, for instance, see that what is maybe a positive development concerning Afghanistan, that different countries are now moving in position to build their own trade relations on a national basis with Afghanistan. This mostly concerns electricity exports from Central Asia to Afghanistan. But I think for an initiative like the New Silk Road of the United States, it will be almost impossible due to corruption, the lack of regional cooperation, and also the problem you cannot design a program on trade if it's not backed up by funding, by a decent document, and also if China is not included. The Silk Road, in the end, the old Silk Road, was about moving products from China to Russia, Europe, and the Middle East. Without China and Iran, this will be almost a mission impossible, I think. Seen from European side, there are also several trade initiatives and transport initiatives that have also not brought about a lot of results. The EU has its policy for Central Asia and a strategy, and it is on a lot of different issues, and trade and investment is one. But if you ask the member states of the European Union what their interest is in Central Asia, almost all of them will say trade and investment with Kazakhstan. That is the country where the interest lies. Kazakhstan, 50% of Kazakh exports go to Europe nowadays. Europe is by far the biggest investor in Kazakhstan. So that's where the opportunity lies. So where America maybe goes too far in trying to push a large regional picture, Europe at the moment is too modest by only focusing on Kazakhstan and leaving Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and the two poorer countries, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, out of the picture. But the main problem remains a complete lack of regional cooperation that will be very difficult to foster for any external player, also for Russia and China.
For the foreseeable future.
Exactly.
Now, the leaders of the 5 Central Asian states, and especially Uzbekistan, often cite Afghan security threats and the potential spillover of instability to justify their internal policies. Do you think that are they representing the situation accurately, or as Jos already indicated, maybe they're hyping the external threats in order to hide the flaws in their own, the governance of their own states?
Mm-hmm. I mean, first of all, there are serious security issues. I mean, look at Afghanistan, look at the history of Tajikistan, look at some of the cells that have been found throughout Central Asia. So you can't just ignore the issue. There are genuine security challenges in the region. That said, some of the government's approaches run the risk of exacerbating that or potentially providing an excuse for other policies. I started off by saying there's an element of a brittle nature to the region. And to address some of the security challenges that I think these governments are going to face over time, a key aspect of that has to not be just a strong domestic security service and structure that can control these issues, but an increasing sense of societal resilience, an increasing sense of resilience in these countries because there are outlets for expression, there are outlets for public debate, there are places within the public space where you can voice differences. And increasingly on the table, there's an understanding of succession, which is obviously one of the most risky aspects of what we see in Central Asia. And so in the absence of broadening the scope of public democratic debate, in the absence of clarity and constitutional procedures of transition, that runs the risk that what might look like a tightly controlled, fairly stable environment could become a serious security challenge overnight. I don't think any of the regimes want that. We certainly don't want that. And so I think part of this is, yes, there's serious security issues. You can't be blind to what's happened in the region and has the potential to happen within the region. But if the governments approach that challenge single-mindedly through the prism of police and security services only, they're not laying the groundwork for long-term stability and security of their societies. I think that's the number one challenge facing many of these leaders today, is how to prepare their countries for the future and how to prepare their countries for future leaders as well.
Damon, you raised some very good points about the brittle nature of some of these regimes. I can point to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in particular, where the leaders have had rumored health issues in the last couple of years, although no one really knows, precisely because there isn't a free and vibrant press in these regions. But what are some of these threats? Do you see the Kazakh leadership in particular has the most to lose? Do you see them doing anything to address this succession issue? And the same goes for Uzbekistan.
I'm sure there are a lot of debates in these countries behind the scenes, and we know very little to almost nothing about this. So it's very difficult to comment on this. Of course, there is a reasonable big chance that if these leaders, Karimov in Uzbekistan, Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, would leave the stage, that there would be a smooth transition, as was in 2006 the case in Turkmenistan. Those chances are there. But there is zero guarantee on this. So it's really a source of concern. I would say especially in Uzbekistan, because it's the biggest, most populous country in the region, where also the repression has been most harsh. So that could lead to Arab Spring situations even at some point. What I see as an enormous problem next to the more general lack of democracy and following human rights agreements is the security sectors of these countries. They are on all aspects a problem for these societies. Basically, these countries, they think in regime security, not in state security. So the security sectors, they are there to protect the regime, not to protect the population of the people of the countries. You see this in all aspects. For instance, the armed forces are completely underdeveloped, poor, thriving only on conscripts and not playing a significant role. The real power is with the intelligence services and the presidential guards and so on. These are very opaque organizations that are often rent-seeking, so basically part of the grey and black economy, and will probably work until the end to guard the regime. On a more general level, in daily life, the police is also an institution that does not guard the people and is involved in community policing, but is really extorting people also because they don't have any income themselves. They play a negative role. And to mention one other security service, the border guards, this is also an enormous problem. The United States, Russia, Europe, and other international players are pouring quite a lot of money into border control programs with zero results so far. The best example is maybe Tajikistan, where the catches of large quantities of drugs on the border has only decreased instead of increased after all this assistance. How is this possible? Mostly because it's the regimes themselves, top-level people, that are directly involved in the drug trade. This makes it impossible for a donor, and this is yet another aspect of the security sectors of these countries, which are not democratic and ineffective and very corrupt. This I see as a security threat in the future.
Now, has Afghanistan blinded, especially the United States, but also the European Union, to these regime security and other flaws that Jos has just identified?
I mean, I think the challenge for particularly American policymakers has been the urgent over the strategic, and the requirement to be focused on what's happening in Afghanistan, where U.S. forces are deployed, led to a lot of transactional relationships in Central Asia in particular, premised on support and access of supplies to our forces in Afghanistan. And I think the pivot is, how do you use the track record of that necessary cooperation, pragmatic, realistic cooperation, to build a stronger base for the future. So I don't think it's fair to say folks have been blinded by Afghanistan, but it has dominated. It's been the rationale. It's been the primary purpose of, if you look at high-level delegations to Central Asia, for a long time many of them were by defense and military officials. Many of them were dominated by what was taking place in Afghanistan, and to a large part that's understandable. We had thousands and thousands of forces, American forces, at risk, deployed in Afghanistan. That's got to be the priority of the U.S. government. But to be smart about it, how is the State Department, how are other agencies inside the U.S. pivoting to think about the ingredients of a long-term relationship that isn't going to be disproportionately led by our defense and security apparatus. So folks have been willing to look over some short-term concerns by focusing on really what's happening in Afghanistan. And I think this process is playing out now as NATO looks to wind down the operation, the International Security Assistance Force. NATO can't succeed. The United States can't succeed in the military stabilization piece of this if it doesn't actually get right some of the political and economic pieces, which have very little to do with NATO, which have very little to do with the Pentagon, which have elements of cooperation with the European Union, and particularly the OSCE. Even this country, Latvia, our host, despite some of the challenges with the Northern Distribution Network, there are countries that have figured out how to make some things work and their relationships in the region. How do you capitalize on that for the future rather than close up shop and abandon that as something that was short-term, practically oriented on Afghanistan in the past?
What should be, it's obvious that relations have to be recalibrated. What should be the top priority in that recalibration for the United States? What is the number one thing that needs to be changed?
I think what is very interesting to see that the United States and Europe have a completely different view of how they approach Central Asia as a region. The United States focuses on Afghanistan, and as a sort of appendix, it has a Central Asia policy. For Europe, it's the other way around. Also, the US sees it as part of Asia. While Europe sees it as part of Eurasia, we see it as the neighbors of our neighbors. And in that sense, Europe completely separates Afghanistan, their policy there, their troops there, their development aid there, from Central Asia. This makes it very hard also for us to cooperate there. What I think should definitely be a priority in development aid, at least, is education. Central Asia has a small population, but a quickly growing population. A lot of young people. The educational systems have completely broken down there. University systems are extremely weak. There are not many international cooperation programs. I think, with the exception of Kazakhstan, maybe, education is a field where we should really invest and where we can also give the opportunity to young people from Central Asia to experience the United States, Europe, also with partnership with Russia. For a lot, it would also be logical to go to Russia. Education is the main issue. I don't see much sense in spreading development aid or a particular focus on a whole series of issues, because there are so many issues that the EU wants to focus on and throws a little bit of money at with almost no impact. So I think we have to be modest in saying we cannot do too much. We have to be realistic. Afghanistan is quickly dropping off the priority list of the United States and also of Europe. Central Asia will drop even quicker off that priority list. We need to be realistic in what we can do, and I think education is an important point, and we will need to be more tough on human rights and democratization especially post-2014. These countries need a third partner next to China and Russia, as was already mentioned before. And they will be eager to work with us, and we will be eager to work with them then.
I guess any conversation, time is winding down, but any conversation involving Central Asia wouldn't be complete without at least examining the question of grand corruption. Mm-hmm. What can be done, very briefly, what can be done in the coming years to show Central Asian leaders the light, so to speak?
You know, this is a tough issue. It's a very tough issue. At the end of the day, corruption is best influenced by leadership at the top. So I think one of the things that's important for us to understand is corruption is not just an economic challenge. It's actually a national security challenge. We've seen, not just in Central Asia, but particularly if you look at Ukraine today, the role that corruption plays in Ukraine is really a national security issue because it begins to undermine core elements of democracy, begins to remove incentives for people to leave office. In fact, it creates concern about what happens to them after they leave office. It can reinforce sort of anti-democratic behavior. It's a real challenge for getting the relationship right in the region. That said, Western programs that focus on the nuts and bolts at a low level, the return on dividends of that is quite difficult because at the end of the day, corruption in society is set by leadership at the top expressing zero tolerance, demonstrating that through prosecutions of folks that are inside the club, inside the family, the ruling circle, creating then the structures of transparency through electronic actions and how the government operates, through higher state wages. So it's going to be a very difficult issue in the absence of the governments themselves willing to take that on. So it has to be part of our conversation, has to be part of our dialogue. I think we're limited in how effective our donor programs can be if we don't have buy-in from a counterpart there. But that goes back to the point that you were just making, and I completely agree with. In addition to, as you think about the future, and first of all, the point that you need a policy that's not independent of Afghanistan is absolutely right. The United States needs to be very clear about its Central Asia strategy and policy, and leading with the sense of we are present. We're present in these debates and these conversations, these activities, regardless of the drawdown in Afghanistan. And this issue of education is right. If you look at Kazakhstan, for example, which has made an investment in some of its people and its education and its elite, many Kazakhs are increasingly being educated in Europe, in the United States, in Russia. President Nazarbayev is creating a future generation of Kazakhs that really are invested in and committed to and will demand a better future for them in their country. That's sowing the long-term seeds which give me optimism when it comes to an issue like corruption or whatever it may be, of seeing a significant investment in education, an exposure of a critical mass of folks coming up through the ranks of government that have lived outside the country, have lived in societies where they see prosperity, security, democracy, and understand the potential benefits that could come as Kazakhstan and other countries take steps down that path.
Well, on that upbeat note, we'll wrap up this coffee break conversation. Thank you, Damon. Thank you, Jos, for joining us. And thank you for viewing.
Thank you very much. Our pleasure.